The history of cultural property destruction begins long before the 1907 Hague Convention. Whether it was Crusaders or Vikings, property destruction and looting during times of conflict have always been prevalent. And while the Hague Convention was a first step in addressing these issues, the protocols were widely ignored during the first major war following it, World War I. Just as today, attacking cultural property is an attack on public morale that was so important in what essentially became a 4-year-long stalemate. The leadership during World War I believed that the best way to win the war was to decrease the enemy's public opinion towards the war so much that they would be forced to surrender. Knowing this, there were active efforts to protect the cultural centers of Europe, most notably Paris, a cultural icon not only for the French, but for all of Europe. While Paris was saved, the destruction outweighed that which was saved. Unfortunately, the Second World War experienced much of the same destruction as seen in the First World War. Cities such as Dresden, Berlin, and Hiroshima were unconditionally bombed. The Nazis focused on the destruction of Jewish culture, from buildings, temples, art, and writings. This was a direct attempt to erase the Jewish history. By eliminating all proof of their culture, the Nazis would remove all proof of the Jewish existence. Amidst this destruction, the Nazis were also notorious looters of European art. They concerned themselves with collecting all important art within the continent in order to create a cultural center for Hitler's Europe. This was to be the greatest art center in Europe, reinventing Hitler's image through the art and propaganda. To combat this, the United States created the Museum, Fine Arts, and Archives program as they entered World War II. This was the first concrete attempt at cultural property protection. General Eisenhower gave specific orders that the responsibility to protect and respect cultural symbols lay with his commanders. In this spirit, selective bombing techniques were used in attempts to preserve the historic structures of Europe. Those involved in the Museum, Fine Arts, and Archives program, nicknamed the Monuments Men, consisted of approximately 400 service members and civilians who worked with the military to safeguard historical and cultural sites from war damage, as well as find and return stolen art. Through their work, the Monuments Men recovered many of the thousands of artworks stolen by the Nazis. In the decades following World War II, the international community turned its attention to more formal protocols for the protection of cultural property in the form of the 1954 Hague Convention. The United States signed the convention upon its revision. However, it was not ratified due to rising Cold War tensions. While the United States did not ratify the protocols until after the fall of the Soviet Union, awareness of cultural property increased.
Moving ahead, now we'll go into the First Gulf War. First, it is important to note that Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein recognized the importance of cultural property in cultivating a national identity. Iraq is composed of a number of different ethnic groups. Hussein built the National Museum and supported ancient cultural sites in order to promote unity between these groups. The U.S. military's approach to cultural property during the First Gulf War is typically viewed in a positive light. Even though the United States had not yet ratified the Hague Convention, they chose to recognize its tenets because so many countries involved in the conflict had ratified it. The United States military also contacted American archaeologists who developed a list of sites to avoid before the conflict. This preparation led to informed decision-making on the ground. There was relatively little cultural site damage during the conflict. However, there are a few exceptions. Tanks drove over brickwork at the Ziggurat. Bulldozing occurred at archaeological sites, and there was some structural damage from blasts. One example of a great military approach to cultural property would be when Saddam Hussein placed military jets next to the Temple of Ur. Under the Hague Convention, these jets made the temple a military objective. Hussein realized this and hoped that the site would be damaged, thus building more resentment toward forward troops. However, the United States chose not to target this site, leaving the site to be enjoyed for its cultural value by future generations. Though the United States military made relatively good decisions regarding cultural property during the First Gulf War, other factors, such as UN trade sanctions against Iraq and general instability, laid groundwork for future cultural property destruction. The trade sanctions made it difficult to recover stolen artifacts. They led to Iraqi unemployment, which led to the creation of the looting profession. Smuggling routes were established, which were used into the 21st century. Also, a demand for illicit objects was created. All these factors contributed to the complicated situation regarding cultural property during the Iraq War. Unlike during the First Gulf War, during Operation Iraqi Freedom, the United States did not recognize the Hague Convention, or prepare with archaeologists to the same extent. Cultural property sites such as mosques, minarets, and archaeological sites frequently became military objectives. When considering cultural property failures by the military, the Iraq National Museum typically comes to mind. During April 2003, after the U.S. military secured Baghdad, 300 to 400 people looted the Iraq National Museum. Initial reports stated that 170,000 objects were stolen. This figure was later adjusted to 14,000, but is still troubling. Colonel Matthew Bogdanos, a Marine reservist, was tasked with recovering these stolen artifacts. As of January 2009, he and his team had recovered over 8,000 of them. Bogdanos stuck to a 4-tier approach for recovering these stolen artifacts. First, he and his team would identify what was missing, which was sometimes difficult because the record keeping at the museum was not the best. Second, they would take pictures of similar artifacts and send them to the international community, such as auction houses and museums, to see if they had seen anything similar. Third, and this was the most important step, they would build relationships locally with religious and community leaders. This was difficult because there was a strong anti-American sentiment, but also the museums were seen as symbols of the old regime. So Bogdanos and his team had to convince people that what they were doing was worthwhile. And fourth, once they located where artifacts were, they would conduct raids. Bogdanos and his team defined 3 different types of looters. The first class of looters are professional looters. This is the looter class that was established after the First Gulf War. And it's most difficult to retrieve these artifacts because these people already had covert networks in place. The second class of looters were insider looters. These are typically staff at the museum. So, for example, if there is a collection space that had been relatively untouched by looting, but a small, very valuable artifact had been taken, it was likely that a staff member was the culprit. These objects were largely retrieved, but they were often found outside of Iraq. The third type of looters are random looters. So these were typically Iraqis who looted the museum to make some quick money or to try and support their families. Bogdanos established an amnesty policy for looting. His team did not prosecute anyone who returned artifacts to the museum, and therefore a vast majority of these items were returned to the museum.
This brief look at the history of cultural property would be incomplete without a discussion of the greatest threat to cultural property in recent years, the terrorist group ISIS, otherwise known as the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. ISIS has been waging a war on cultural property for the last few years. It leverages cultural property as well as its destruction for a variety of purposes. First, as a terror tactic. The major acts of destruction of cultural, religious, and historic sites that ISIS perpetrates are announced in advance, with social media being used to publicize the carefully choreographed destruction of these sites online. ISIS also chooses sites that will have optimal effect in terrorizing populations and chasing out those whom they deem undesirable. The destruction of an enemy's cultural property is hardly a recent occurrence. Governments and other groups have done so since ancient times. However, it is the scale and public manner in which ISIS does this that sets it apart. Secondly, ISIS uses the destruction of cultural property to humiliate local communities and international powers. ISIS uses the international outrage to make itself seem invincible and highlight the powerlessness of its opponents. The group seeks to inflict pain on the West and other parts of the world that prize the evidence of these ancient civilizations that are the original shared roots of so many cultures. Thirdly, recruitment. ISIS uses these destructive shows of power and subjugation of its enemies to recruit fighters to its cause. Fourth, ISIS uses the destruction to execute what the UN has called cultural genocide. In an effort to create a single, homogeneous Muslim regime under its control, ISIS destroys people's shrines and ancient sites in order to wipe out local identity and sever the connection to the past, thus destroying any evidence of the racial, ethnic, cultural, and religious diversity of a region that's been deemed the cradle of civilization, while also obscuring the common ground and peaceful coexistence that has historically existed in that area. ISIS is intimidated by this history because it delegitimizes them. At the same time, attacking a people's cultural works is equivalent to attacking their very identity and historical memory. The destruction orphans future generations, severely damaging their understanding of who they are as people, while also makes them ideal targets for conversion to the one selective, singular historical narrative that ISIS is trying to impose. While not necessarily ISIS's goal, this selective cultural destruction also fuels division, violent extremism, and conflict, which directly inhibits critical post-war national reconciliation. Finally, contrary to expectations, ISIS hasn't really been eradicating all evidence of idolatrous or enemy cultures. They destroyed the large, immovable culture for show, but they take the rest to sell. Looting is ISIS's second largest source of revenue, after oil. In fact, one of the aspects that sets ISIS apart from other powers or terrorist organizations is the fact that they have turned looting and the illicit sale of antiquities into an industrial operation. ISIS considers cultural property a natural resource to be seized and mined for their purposes. Estimates in 2014 contended that ISIS is the wealthiest terrorist organization in the world. Indeed, unlike Al-Qaeda or Hezbollah, ISIS is so well-financed that it is able to pay annual salaries to its members. Having now heard a brief history of cultural property, as well as the threats it faces, it is important to turn to the question of what role can the military play in protecting it, as well as underscore the importance of cultural property education. This can be accomplished in part by looking at a few recent missteps and successes that the U.S. military has had in the last several years. Starting first with the missteps, perhaps the most well-known example is one from 2003 to 2004, in which U.S. soldiers turned the ancient site of Babylon in Iraq into Camp Alpha. In doing so, a 2,500-year-old brick pavement to the famous Ishtar Gate was smashed by tanks, and the gate itself damaged. Soldiers filled sandbags with soil filled with archaeological fragments. Large areas of the site were bulldozed and covered in compacted gravel for helipads and parking lots, and trenches dug damaged an area near the ancient ziggurat, as well as other parts of the site. You can see the full extent of the damage illustrated on this map. In another instance, the minaret of Iraq's Great Mosque of Samarra was used as a sniper's nest by U.S. troops between 2004 and 2005. Built in the 9th century, the mosque was once the greatest mosque in the world. With its dramatic spiraling cone design, the tower is one of the most recognized buildings in the Middle East, and was featured on Iraq's currency. Unfortunately, a few days after the snipers conceded to Iraqi antiquities officials and vacated the tower, insurgents bombed the top floor of the minaret, presumably to prevent future use by U.S. snipers. A final example, as already mentioned, is the looting of the National Museum of Iraq, shortly after the 2003 invasion. The U.S. military received a great deal of criticism for failing to anticipate that cultural sites like the museum would be vulnerable and potentially fall victim to looting in the wake of the invasion. Others felt that U.S. troops could have responded to the looting faster, or done more to stem the ransacking. That being said, the U.S. military has also had a great number of successes in protecting and recovering cultural property. Some notable examples include the recovery of the head and sacred vase of Warka in 2003. Known as the Mona Lisa of Mesopotamia, the head is a 5,200-year-old sculpture and the earliest known representation of the female face. It had been stolen from the National Museum in Iraq. With help from Corinne Wegener, a leader in cultural property preservation and a former Army reservist, coalition forces were educated and military police helped put up wanted posters throughout Baghdad. All of this helped lead to the head's recovery by Army military police. The vase of Warka was recovered by Matthew Bogdanos and his team. In another noteworthy example, days after coalition forces took control of Baghdad, Mobile Exploitation Team Alpha were looking for weapons of mass destruction in the Iraqi intelligence headquarters. What they found instead was the Iraqi Jewish Archive, thousands of Jewish communal and religious books and documents that had been confiscated from synagogues. They were in the building's basement, which was filled with 4 feet of water. Thanks to efforts of the team, these documents were recovered and taken into the hands of conservators in the U.S. A third example of U.S. military success with cultural property is the discovery by U.S. Special Operations Forces of hundreds of archaeological and historical objects and documents during a raid on one of ISIS's top leaders, Abu Sayyaf. Some of those objects had been stolen from the Mosul Museum in Iraq, and the records they found gave great insight into ISIS's illicit antiquities trade. Finally, artists and other professionals in Italy have been able to create incredible replicas of statuary from the ancient Assyrian site of Nimrud based on high-definition photographs taken by U.S. military personnel. Thank you for watching. We hope you found this segment on the history of cultural property to be useful. Please look for the next video outlining pre-deployment resources and operational guidelines concerning cultural property.